running the event as a webinar, so obviously everyone's muted, but we do want to encourage some questions and answers. So if you want to type a question, you're very welcome to do so in the Q&A box, which is if you hover over the bottom, if you're not a Zoom aficionado, and you can type a question there, and I will attempt to redirect the questions to the most suitable person to answer at the end of the session. You can actually unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. So if you want to, there's also a raise hand button at the bottom. And if you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can actually ask a question if you prefer to do it that way. So don't be shy and please ask some questions at the end. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Billy from Centrepoint. Thanks, Billy.
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks everyone for joining today. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this works. Does that seem to be working okay? Fantastic. Okay, and hopefully my internet holds up. So yeah, so like Vicky said, I'm Billy Harding. I'm Senior Policy and Research Officer at Centrepoint, the National Youth Homelessness Charity. And I should be kind of giving a quick presentation today about Centrepoint's work, a bit of an overview of youth homelessness across the UK, and then talk a bit about how Centrepoint's been affected and the young people we work with have been impacted over the last year over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, before talking a bit about some of our current kind of policy and campaigning priorities. So yeah, hopefully it's useful and interesting for your work. So quickly, just about Centrepoint, for those who don't know so much about us. So we're a national youth homelessness charity. We're established just over 50 years ago in 1969. And we were established when the Reverend of St Anne's Church in Soho saw that lots of young people were sleeping rough in central London. So lots of young people kind of were coming to London, didn't have anywhere to stay, and ended up being on the streets, kind of at massive risk. So the Reverend of the church kind of opened up the crypt as an emergency night shelter. And then since then, we've kind of grown into a national charity. So our doors are still open, but youth homelessness is still a major issue, not just in central London, but across the entirety of the UK. So yeah, we support young people aged between 16 to 25 who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And I guess our core model of support is supported accommodation, so hostels, foyers, and kind of various semi-independent accommodation and services. We work across London, Yorkshire, Manchester, and Sunderland. We also work with a network of partners across the country, so with a number of kind of other youth homelessness organisations and charities supporting young people. And we also operate a national helpline for young people needing housing and homelessness advice. That's a free helpline for any young person who's kind of worried about their housing situation, or anybody who's worried about a young person's housing situation. And I should say as well, so obviously, accommodation is our kind of core support, but beyond that, we kind of build support for things like, access to employment, education and training, support for kind of mental and physical health. And of course, kind of all of our services are there to support young people with a view to kind of them moving on to independence and into their own accommodation, which, I'm sure as many people on the call are aware, is increasingly difficult. And I should say as well that we're not based on Tottenham Court Road, so we don't work out of the Centrepoint Tower. Unfortunately, that would be nice. So yeah, that's a bit about Centrepoint. And then in terms of, I guess, my role and the kind of team I work in, so I work in the policy and research team at Centrepoint. So we kind of seek to influence government policy in order to better support young people going through homelessness. So I guess our key areas of focus around kind of housing, employment, and social security, but we kind of look at a wide range of issues affecting young people who might be going through homelessness. And we do this by conducting research in order to build the evidence base to better understand what are the key issues affecting young people, and really kind of help them make the case for change. So yeah, we then use this research to raise awareness kind of with MPs, ministers, also local government companies, to campaign for change and really make a positive difference for young people going through homelessness. And I guess one recent example of success through our work was our Chance to Move On campaign. So this kind of came from a piece of research that we did back in 2018, looking at the challenges faced by young people when they're ready to leave supported accommodation but were unable to. And a key challenge that we identified through this was benefit rates, and effectively local housing allowance rates for young people who are only entitled to the shared accommodation rate being far too low, and just making it almost impossible to actually find anywhere to rent in the private rented sector. So through this research, we understood, what these challenges were, and we kind of ran a national campaign So I think we got over 20,000 signatures to our petition to improve LHA rates for young people. Got supporters to tweet their MPs, write their MPs, and then through this, we were really happy in that last year's budget, the government announced they would be exempting kind of more groups of people, including young people under 25 who've been in supported accommodation, and care leave was up to 25 from the shared accommodation rate, meaning that they could access more money when it came to moving on into the private rented sector. And obviously, it's not by no means a silver bullet for young people looking to move on, but hopefully this will make a real difference for those young people looking to access accommodation in the private rented sector. So yeah, that's a bit about the policy and research work that we do at Centrepoint and kind of some of the things that we try and achieve. So then kind of looking at the scale of youth homelessness, so just how many young people do we think across the country are facing homelessness? So what we do is an annual piece of research, the Youth Homelessness Data Bank, where we submit freedom of information requests to local authorities across the country to kind of find out how many young people are approaching them for housing support, and also what kind of support are they getting? Are they being accommodated? Are they kind of getting support through the prevention and relief duties? So we found that in our most recent data bank, which was 2019-20, so just before the pandemic, 121,000 young people across the UK approached their council for housing assistance because they were either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And the main reason we saw was, due to family and friends not being able to accommodate. And quite alarmingly as well, so we saw that almost 6 in 10 young people, so the majority of young people, there was no kind of recorded positive outcome. So their homelessness was neither relieved or prevented, this wasn't recorded, and they weren't offered kind of permanent accommodation. So we're really concerned that, that for lots of young people, it's not clear what, if any, support they're actually getting when they're going to local authorities. So we're doing a lot of work to kind of understand what's happening there and kind of working with authorities to ensure that young people are getting that support. And then in terms of, I guess, a more recent figure is the latest chain data. So this is London specific, and this is the measure of kind of people who are seen sleeping rough and, with nowhere to stay at all in London. And we saw that over the 1920, I think that should be 2021, we saw that over 1,000 young people seen sleeping rough, an increase from the previous year, and in spite of all the various interventions that have been put in place over the pandemic, so things like Everyone In, and the support for people going through homelessness during this time. So really concerned that youth homelessness is a massive issue across the country, and we've just seen it in many ways get more severe over the pandemic. We're really concerned that young people still need that support. And in terms of, I guess, looking back in a bit more detail over the last year, so we kind of did a bit of a review of kind of the impact on our services and the young people we work with. Just by way of context, I'm sure everyone's aware that young people have been amongst the hardest hit when it comes to particularly the economic and labour market impacts of the pandemic. So over the last year, youth unemployment has risen to 13%. It's not quite as bad as it was, I think, toward the end of last year, but still there's a definite increase in the number of young people who aren't in work as a result of the pandemic. Due in part to sectors that, traditionally employ young people, such as, accommodation and food and services, particularly hit by various lockdowns. And we've also seen a massive increase in the number of young people seeking support through the social security system. So almost 1 million 16 to 24s were on universal credit in April 2021. Which is a massive increase from where it was last year. Although I should say as well, this is not just young people who are out of work. So obviously some young people in work also receiving universal credit. But it does show that the level of need has increased for young people needing support through the social security system. But to take note as well of kind of significant schemes of investment that have been put into place by DWP, such as Kickstarter, youth hubs and youth employability coaches. So there are things in place. Whether it's enough is yet to be seen. But I think it's a good time to kind of talking about the social security system for young people and kind of highlighting the support that they need. And then in terms of, I guess, some more specific impacts on our own services and the young people we work from our own helpline. So over the last year, we had a record number of calls to helpline, up by a third from the year before. With a peak in September where we had over 1,300 young people calling because they were homeless or they needed some kind of housing assistance. And as usual, again, family breakdown was the single biggest cause of homelessness. And kind of speaking to young people, speaking to our colleagues during this time, housing options which might ordinarily be available, so things like sofa surfing or less formal arrangements, staying with family and friends, were made much more difficult. Where effectively sofa surfing had been made illegal during the pandemic. It was much more difficult to kind of stay with different family members or different friends. And as a result, we've seen an increase in young people, in the most desperate situations. So we've seen a slight increase in the number of young people who are sleeping rough during the time of their call. Also, as well, we've seen really through speaking to colleagues on the helpline, real difficulties for young people actually getting through to the local authority and kind of making those formal homelessness applications. So particularly, during the start of the earlier lockdowns, when kind of a lot of services kind of moved entirely online, we've spoke to young people having real trouble getting through to anybody, with long wait times for assessments, and concerning as well, some young people being asked to prove that they're homeless. So local authorities kind of asking young people to basically sleep rough and be picked up by outreach teams in order to be able to access support, which we find is really concerning, and is not something any young person should have to do to get that support. We've also seen young people who have lost accommodation, particularly in the private rented sector, through kind of illegal and unfair evictions, because not knowing their rights, not knowing that these protections were in place, and young people are losing accommodation that way. So from a helpline, we've seen a massive increase in need, and young people in really desperate situations needing that support. And then in terms of the young people that we're working with kind of through our accommodation services, so in terms of mental health, so over half of young people have already been identified and are reported as having a mental health need, even pre-COVID. But since the onset of the pandemic, we've seen a massive increase, 40% increase in demand for in-house mental health support. And we know it's been such a difficult time for so many young people we support. And around financial insecurity and wider food insecurity. So even with the £20 a week uplift universal credit, which in many ways has been such a godsend for young people we work with, there's been some real financial challenges. And we've seen a real kind of explosion in the number of young people needing emergency food support. So emergency food actions by Centrepoint were up by 276%. So these are things like referrals to food banks, food vouchers, this kind of thing, compared to the previous year. So plenty of young people in real hardship over this time. But I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. So I mean, just to highlight, the resilience of our frontline services, and a real testament to my colleagues, working on the frontline in Centrepoint. So while we have had infections and things like that, all of our accommodation services have remained open throughout the pandemic, even though this is, I'm sure lots of people on the call have been in a similar situation, particularly during the start of the pandemic, having to try and source protective equipment, ensure that services could remain operational was a real challenge. But I'm glad to say that Centrepoint rose to this challenge. And despite things like the logistical challenges, we continue to provide mental health support and learning services for those who need it. New ways of working, so a lot of big kind of move to digital provision, which in many ways has been a challenge, and it's not ideal, but in some ways has worked. And I think there are some things which we will look at taking forward, as we can, as restrictions are lifted. And in many areas, the pandemic's led to stronger local partnerships and collaboration with our partners, so kind of with local authorities, with housing providers, as well as kind of other local partners. And I think this has been, I guess, one good thing that has come out of the challenges we've all faced over the last year. And then just a bit about our current policy priorities, the kind of current things that we're focusing on in terms of campaigning. So a big one is universal credit. So we're joining colleagues across the sector to make the £20 uplift permanent, and ensure that rates for young people match the real cost of living. So you're probably aware that under 25s get, I think, about £15 a week less than over 25s, and at Centrepoint we see this causing real hardship. So kind of one of the key areas we're campaigning on is kind of equalising benefit rates for young people who are living independently. Just going to give them a bit more financial support. We also want to see long-term funding for youth-specific accommodation across the country, including specialist emergency accommodation. So the Everyone In scheme was fantastic, but I think it did highlight the need for kind of specialist provision for young people. So we're still making the case that across the country there should be this provision available. We want to ensure that work pays for young people living in supported accommodation. So I don't know if anyone here works in and around supported accommodation, but the rules around moving into work can be very complicated and leave young people worse off. And as a result, it can act as a real disincentive for young people moving into employment. So we're kind of in discussions with DWP and campaigning to slightly tweak the benefits rules to kind of ensure that work does pay for young people. And there's young people that do want to move into work while living in supported accommodation. And we're also keen to kind of there's a package of support for tenants who've accrued rent arrears due to COVID-19. So obviously, with a massive increase in rent arrears over last year, and again, younger tenants being particularly affected, We need to see something long-term in place that's going to help people kind of remain in accommodation and ensure people aren't trapped in debt because challenges they may have faced over the last year. So those are kind of some of our key policy priorities, and I think kind of the main things we're working on over this year and next. And then the last thing to highlight is just a bit about kind of another line of work that we're doing at Centrepoint, which is our independent living programme. So this is kind of a response to the fact that that so many young people in our services and beyond are struggling to move into independent accommodation. So Centrepoint is kind of looking at developing its own, I think, move-on option for young people. So this is kind of modular, self-contained accommodation, kind of using off-site construction methods, but of a really high quality for young people to access, and where we can, kind of utilising meanwhile use and temporary sites, so kind of working with local authorities and working with landowners and developers to kind of create some accommodation where we can. And this is the kind of accommodation where rents capped at around a third of a young person's earnings, to ensure that housing remains affordable, kind of whatever young person's situation is, and allow them to kind of save up the cost of kind of moving on beyond the independent living programme. And so Centrepoint, we're on track to deliver 300 units across London and Manchester by the end of 2021. And we're currently fundraising to expand this programme. And I should say as well, I'm by no means an expert on this one, but if anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to kind of put you in touch with our independent living team, because it's a really exciting scheme, I think, and something that Centrepoint hasn't really moved into before. And then just from the top of my head, just I mean, as a group of housing associations here, just thinking about how can associations support young people, I guess, during this time and going beyond the pandemic. So I think the first thing is ensuring that allocations and nominations processes aren't penalising young people. So I think at Centrepoint, we've seen kind of over the years it's getting increasingly difficult for young people to access social rented accommodation. So we ensure that providers are doing all they can, that young people aren't being unfairly blocked from accessing this kind of accommodation. I guess for young residents, already kind of living in your services, supporting young residents to access employment and training opportunities where possible. And finally, as I'm sure many organisations are doing already, campaign for investment into generally affordable housing. So I think kind of join the sector, join I guess the wider campaign to make the case for government that we do need supply generally affordable housing for young people, and not just for young people, but I think to give them a chance to generally and successfully move on from homelessness. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I think that was quite a rapid tour of some stuff Centrepoint's on, but hopefully that was interesting and useful. I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you, Billy. That was really great overview. Lots covered, and really appreciate that. I think I was amazed that 1 million 16 to 24-year-olds are on universal credit, which is quite a staggering number. But it's great that you've brought in the reform, or managed to campaign towards the reforms, and great to hear about the investment from the DWP into employability schemes, which I think are making a massive difference. But yeah, just some just staggering statistics there on 40% of the young people you see need 40% increase in demand for mental health. We're all affected by this pandemic, but I think young people, and particularly vulnerable young people, are even more so, which is it is sad to hear that the hardship they're going through. Yeah, really interesting. So if you have any questions for Billy, please, you can type them in the Q&A now if you like, if anything comes to mind, and then we can look to answer them at the end of the session. So we're now going to move on to Lucy Bowyer from AKT charity, who's going to talk about the challenges for LGBTQ plus young people with regard to homelessness. So hi, Lucy.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm Lucy Bowyer. I'm the Director of Services at AKT, and I use the pronoun she, her. I've worked for AKT for about 9 years now, and similar to some of the things that Billy was just saying around the challenges for young people, completely echoed over the last year. And I'm going to take us through a little bit about AKT and a little bit of our research as well around that we did this year around LGBTQ plus homelessness. So who are we? So some people may know us as the Albert Kennedy Trust. We're the national LGBTQ plus youth homelessness charity, and we were founded in Manchester in 1989. So the group of people there, in the middle there is Kath Hall, who was known as Kath Johnson. She was a straight ally and foster carer, and she brought together a group of people who overcame the extreme homophobia, biphobia and transphobia of the time to support young people. So basically saw that there were issues similar to the start of Centrepoint, where young people were on the streets, young people were in really difficult and challenging situations and needed support. And Kath had seen that and got together a group from the community and said, what we're going to do about this. And there was quite a toxic environment in Manchester towards LGBT people at the time. The police, chief of police was really kind of quite challenging, as particularly around the gay village. But they fought through all of that and put together a charity that was able to help those young people. And unfortunately, Albert Kennedy, who the charity is named after, was a young person who fell to his death from a car park in the middle of Manchester around the same time. And in his honour, that's why we named the charity. And quite interesting, we were the first LGBT charity in the UK and actually had to have a legal fight to be able to become a charity. And some things have changed in the last 30 odd years, but I think at the moment we're seeing a lot of toxicity towards trans people. Similar headlines and stuff that we saw around the time that Kath founded the charity are being levelled at the moment. So we're seeing that some things have changed, other things not quite so much, unfortunately. So we're based in London, Manchester, Newcastle upon Tyne, and Bristol. With physical face-to-face services, and we also have an online service which obviously has grown and grown over the past year. And what we offer is advice, guidance, advocacy and support to anybody who identifies as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning their identity, who are aged between 16 and 25, and who are homeless, at risk of homelessness. And one of the key areas over the last year has been living in a hostile environment. Some of our young people have lived in quite horrible situations, in lockdowns with families that they might not want to be in the same area as, but also in other relationships or just basically in between housing. We also offer some housing, so we have our host programme, which is where people offer up a room in their house for a young person, and Purple Door, which is our service that we run with Clarion, which is a short stay hostel in London for young people. We also offer mentoring, so that's either with older volunteers, or we actually have a peer mentoring programme in Bristol and a fledgling one in Newcastle upon Tyne as well, which has been particularly welcomed by our young people who want to meet people and who've had the same journeys as them. We also have our live chat and digital service online, which we're developing even more so than last year. In the last quarter, we had 150 chats just from across the UK, and that was in a 3-month period. And so it just shows that there's a lot of capacity, a lot of young people who are feeling quite isolated. We also have a youth engagement programme, which is usually face-to-face, but has been online throughout the pandemic, which is giving young people a space to come and talk to each other and feel less on their own. And we also deliver training. So what about LGBTQ plus youth homelessness? So up to 24% of the 150,000 young people facing threat of homelessness in the UK identify as being LGBT, which is always quite a shocking stat for people. 77% of those young people come into our site at family rejection and abuse after coming out as the primary reason for their homelessness. And once they're homeless, LGBT young people are more likely to experience targeted violence, discrimination, substance abuse problems, sexual exploitation, higher levels of risky sexual behaviour, poor mental health and well-being. And that is particularly key at the moment. I would thought nearly 100% of our young people coming to us and saying that they're struggling with their mental well-being. And also that intersectional identities mean that some young people from further marginalised groups, particularly from Black and POC and trans young people, and people whose identities go across those things, are facing multiple discrimination and challenges when seeking secure, safe accommodation. Just an eye over COVID, that was particularly true for young Black men who were approaching us at the beginning of the first lockdown, who had, I think what we saw was that we've never been able to get official statistics for this true scale of the problem for LGBT youth homelessness. But we've always known that there was a lot of times when LGBT young people fly under the radar. So they do the same things as every other young person, sofa surfing, and spending time on night buses and things to try and hide, and that wouldn't normally get picked up by traditional outreach methods. But what we found at the last lockdown is all of those things that were available for our young people just stopped. And so young people were absolutely desperate. In March and April last year, particularly, we saw a 118% national increase. And we've seen quite a lot of young people from outside of our main cities as well. And it was a huge rise in demand for us. And we saw more young people who were actually forced into rough sleeping or were on the cusp of rough sleeping. And that has continued. And particularly for young Black men in London, we had a lot of issues around where young people were, as Billy said, being asked by local authorities to basically sleep rough before that they would get any assistance, and being targeted by police and not able to stay in the same places meant that we were really struggling to get safe spaces for young people, and also other organisations to understand the risk that being LGBTQ, Black or a person of colour, and young on the streets just added to those people's risk, and meant that they needed help quicker and faster, but that wasn't forthcoming. So we had to increase our service delivery teams, especially in our London office, and in our digital team as well, just to be able to cope with the demand for our service. And young people, as I said, was experiencing high levels of mental health and suicidal thoughts during lockdown, and that's continued. And I think the strain that we're seeing on mental health services is just going to have this impact on this generation for quite some time to come. So this is a little picture of our demographics of our young people. As you can see, I think it's even higher proportion for people of colour in London. At the moment, it's probably more something about 84%. And we also see quite a large proportion of trans young people, and that increases in Newcastle upon Tyne as well. But similarly, Bristol, which was our region that we opened up in 2019, have also seen a similar level of trans young people coming to us for support. And that's from across the southwest as well. So not just in Bristol, which is our key city, but across Devon and Cornwall and the surrounding counties. And as you can see, there's a full spectrum of ways that young people identify themselves as well. So we did a report, which was a piece of research that centred the voices and experiences of young people who faced any form of homelessness in the last 5 years. So previously to just recently, sexuality is not something that was compulsorily recorded in statutory figures. The government have now changed that, but we're obviously going to have to wait for a year to see how much these data is being collected and how effective that is. So we did our own research, and 2/3 of the young people that took part said they were repeatedly belittled by their family members to the extent that they felt worthless before they became homeless. And don't forget, a lot of young people in lockdowns had to go home. Some young people went back in the closet. Some young people felt that they had to detransition and go back into an environment that they left. That's quite true of students, particularly. They were really worried about going home into an environment that they'd actually been able to leave. So that obviously creates levels of trauma for those young people. 1 in 6 LGBTQ plus young people were forced to do sexual acts against their will by family members before becoming homeless. And just 13% of LGBTQ plus young people felt supported by parents or step-parents whilst facing homelessness. It's quite shocking. And over half of LGBTQ plus young people said that being homeless had a negative impact on their physical health. And worryingly, I think most LGBTQ people didn't seek support from their local authority whilst homeless. BAME young people were particularly less likely to seek support from their family while homeless as well. And just 1/3 of LGBTQ plus young people sought support from their local authority whilst homeless. And less than half of LGBTQ plus young people who are homeless are aware of what support services are available to them, and even less aware of things around mental health, welfare, benefits, sexual health and money advice. And there's quite a reticence for people sometimes to go to mainstream services because they don't feel necessarily that their experiences are understood or taken seriously. We have had young people approaching local authorities who've just been told to just, you know, pretend that they're not LGBTQ and stay at home because, you know, they can do that. It's something that you can repress in order to stay in a housing situation, and not really taking seriously the levels of abuse or the danger and risks that young LGBT people face. And as I said before, BAME, trans and disabled young people are even less likely to know about and be able to access support services. So yeah, nearly a quarter of young people generally were not aware of any support services, and many LGBT young people didn't feel supported by those services. Experience of misgendering and dead naming when accessing services were also reported. We've also had young people outed to families when they've gone for assistance by a housing worker, just speaking to families like it's a, you know, somebody's come and said, I need to leave my house because if I come out, I'm at risk. They've phoned the parents and actually outed them and put them even further at risk, and then refused to help or give temporary accommodation whilst that young person can sort for themselves other things out. And actually sometimes the questions aren't even asked. So a huge part of some of the reasons behind someone's homelessness that may actually add to them being seen as in priority need are actually just not even asked why. So, you know, some people don't even feel safe to disclose that information. And just 1/5 of LGBT young people felt supported when accessing those services. And over half of young LGBT people have faced some form of discrimination from services whilst homeless. And that includes discrimination due to their sexual orientation, gender identity, illness, disability, or just being homeless in itself. And there's a quote there from one of our young people about being trans and finding it really difficult to be able to be out or talk or access support. So how can we make this a bit better for young people? So recommendations here, including short copies of communication materials, more individualised support and more group support in their communities. And half of LGBTQ+ young people want to see services use more inclusive language which recognises their identity. Often you'll have a form, particularly around gender, where you're either male or female or other, actually recording different identities such as non-binary, make young people feel like that service is for them, and actually that's recognised and taken seriously, and that you also know who you've got living in your homes and can support them in that way. And almost half of our young people that were surveyed want to see services use more people who look like them in communications materials. And we'd ask that people adopt prevention and early action focused solutions to LGBTQ+ youth homelessness. So working in partnership with us, we work with Clarion to provide a housing service and also longer term housing options. So we're currently working as part of the London Youth Gateway with our partners New Horizons and Stonewall Housing and other groups with some housing associations to try and find a way that we can get young people into social housing, because move on is such a huge issue. And a lot of our young people just need some housing with a bit of support, but find that there's a lot of barriers, particularly if you haven't been found statutorily homeless. Your options are really small. And if you have other needs, such as trans people needing their own personal space, that would find difficult to share or feel that, you know, they might be further discriminated against, we need to find those ways through. So, you know, if you're part of those groups, is finding ways to open up your nominations to marginalised communities such as LGBTQ+ people. One of the big things is staff training. Knowing what questions to ask and how to deal with them is really important, but similarly also monitoring the information that you get for young people, even if it's not statutory. How do you know that you're meeting everybody's needs if you don't even know what the needs of those young people are who are living with you? And that's particularly true if you've got young people who are living with families and there are issues. Have you kind of recorded what they are, or is there a service like ours that you can offer to us? And obviously support initiatives such as the Together Alliance, and also things like sharing your pronouns. At the beginning of this, I shared my pronouns. It means that young people are invited, or colleagues are invited, to be able to identify themselves, and that you can respectfully identify them. But also you know, if you do see a young person that needs our support, please do get in touch with us on our website, spread our report around as well, and just get the word out there around how people can support young LGBTQ people who are homeless. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lucy. That was another fantastic presentation. You know, some of the same themes echoed as Billy, but I think, you know, it's interesting to hear that it can be even more exacerbated for LGBTQ young people, you know, living in hostile environments. But thank you for highlighting some of the things that you know, housing associations and other services can do to help, you know, in terms of asking the right questions, so we know their needs better, using inclusive language, and recording who is actually living in our services, so that we can actually, you know, adjust our services accordingly, and perhaps introduce the staff training that we need to sort of to help them. So thank you, really interesting. And again, if you've got any questions for Lucy, please don't hesitate to type them in the Q&A box, and we can attempt to answer them at the end of the session. So we're now going to move on to Ray Austin from One Housing, who's going to talk about their brilliant services in London and their partnerships with various organisations to provide a holistic support approach. So we'll move on to Ray.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks very much. Okay, let me go and share my screen. Hope everyone can see that.
Yep.
Right. Okay, hope everyone can see that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Austin. I'm the head of Homelessness Prevention, and I'm with my colleague today, Kathleen Hopgood, who's the strategic head of homelessness. So going straight in. So this is a nice picture about us. I'll be whizzing through these. You get a bit of context of the organisation and how we work. So obviously, One Housing own and manage over 70,000 homes in London and South East, land over to over 35,000 residents. One Housing's care and support division manages and operates 49 care and support services in London, Essex and Oxfordshire, Kent and Bedfordshire. We've got senior living, we've got mental health, homelessness and prevention. We have over 8,000 customers supported, young people, young parents, former rough sleepers, or those at risk of homelessness, adults with mental health needs, older people. We have Baycroft, portfolio of 5 private, which are CQC registered care homes in Kent, Essex, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. So let's give you just a bit of an oversight about One Housing. I want to talk to you more about the division that myself and Kathleen oversee. So it's a very new division, okay, and it has kind of 3 key components to it. We've got the hostels and homeless services, we've got prevention services, which are previously, as we all know, float support, and also we've got young people supported accommodation services. We believe this structure enables us to deliver a range of homeless and prevention service under one subdirectorate that better reflects our core work within One Housing. So let's give you a bit more details into that, because it could be helpful for all those that are listening into the webinar as well. So we've got Arlington, as you can see, there's 95 beds. So I'm just going to pick up 2 lines from each one. 95 bed mixed use flagship homeless service, and that is based in Camden. Okay, 44 self-contained units for single people on low income. And in here you can see Clarence House. That's another purpose-built hostel in Bedford, accommodating 29 homeless and former rough sleepers in self-contained studio apartments. And then we've got the JLA Move On, which is part of the Mayors for London Move On programme. The service provides a mix of accommodation and community-based support service to 92 former sleepers throughout London. And we also got supported accommodation for former rough sleepers in Enfield, and we have prevention services in Lewisham and Bedford. Okay, so let's give you a quick flavour of that as well. So this is what we feel about young people and homelessness. You know, we believe that homelessness is a key trigger for a range of long-term and short-term problems faced by young people 16 to 25 years, including anyone in a combination of creed and substance misuse, unemployment, criminal activity, including violence, sexual exploitation. And any of these issues can cause longer-term problems for both the individual, their families, and society. So let's give you a bit of breakdown of some of the services that we run across London. So obviously we're across quite a number of different local authorities, to include Camden, Hackney, Islington, Lewisham, Tower Hamlets and Westminster. So we're doing a range of services working with young people. They include life skills, budgeting, conflict resolution, forming relationships, CV and job application writing, tenancy sustainment, rights and responsibilities, just managing their emotions. So let's give you a further breakdown of some of those services because it could be useful for people. What types of services are actually in the boroughs like there? For example, in Camden, it's called Artemis House and it's the assessment centre for 16 to 21. Please note that a lot of the services you'll see, I'll put 16 to 21, but they do go up to 25 with additional needs. In some cases, if they've got LD, it could even go up to 30. But here you can see it's a teenage parents, 8 units, 4 self-contained and 4 shared. So that's quite useful because the 4 self-contained may be for teenage parents who have got more skilled, and the 4 shared where you might have concerns regarding those parents. So you want them closer to the office, for example, so you can monitor them more effectively. And then we're looking at Camden Progress North, which is part of Young People's Pathway, and that's accommodation for homeless young people as well. So you've got 16 and 12 units. In the 12 units, they're split up 6 and 6. So you'll have 6 females and 6 males in the same scheme. So let's look at Hackney. So Hackney, we've got Kennel Hall Road, again, teenage parents, 11 units. Difference here, all the units here are self-contained. All the units, and a couple of flats there are 1 bed as well. And we've got Timber Wolf, there's another place, for teenage parents, 7 units, all self-contained. And then we've got Rushmore Road and Elderfield Road, 16 units, 24-hour complex needs service. So when we say 24 hours, that means it has night covers. That means there's staff on site throughout the day and throughout the evening. So moving on, let's have a look at Islington. So Islington run a pathway. It's called Assessment and Progression and Visit and Support. Visit and Support, which we know is, in a sense, floating support, in a sense, what we previously know it. You can see this is quite a large service there. You've got 29 assessment progression places, then you've got 27 visit and support. And then here we've got Lewisham as well, which is a medium need service. We provide support on teenage parents, again, 16 to 25, 21 units, again, quite light service, and then 15 units for teenage parents as well. Then we're moving on to Westminster. So we've got Gosfield Street, which is in the heart of West End, quite close to Oxford Street, for those that know it. That's 11 units, all self-contained, low support, last part of the pathway. So young people are there between 8 and 12 months. It's the last stage of the pathway when they get ready for move on. So we're moving on now to Tower Hamlets. It's Whites Row Assessment Centre, again, 16 to 21, 14 units. But what's unique here is 2 of these are crash pads. So for big interesting for people who want to get a bit about different services and different design, but we'd start to tell you a bit more about Whites Row and what makes that service quite different and quite unique. So here we go, pick up some big features from there. So Whites Row Assessment Centre, right, it's the starting point of the young people's pathway. Any pathway must have a start, in my view, and must have an end, in a sense. So this is the beginning, this is where they're assessing the needs of young people. Right, the scheme has 12 rooms plus 2 emergency bed places that can be accessed 24 to 48 hours. So that's interesting. Okay, that's 12 units, and then you've got 2 emergency bed spaces as well that can be used in an emergency, right? And then what we've got there is an in-hour mediation service, and then we've got sleeping 7 days a week and more or less double cover. So it would be good to give you a good sense of kind of the size and scope of this. So this is the front of the building, it's got 3 doors. It's got a number of floors as well. It's got 3 floors in the building. That's the front. Quite close to Liverpool Street Station, Whites Road, for those that know it as well. So I'll take you to more information so you can get a bit of sense of, take you in through the looking glass or the keyholes, they would say on TV. So having the social inclusion room here, you get a sense of there, what does it look like? So you can see on the left, you've got your computers and stuff like that, which is, for young people now that engage in lots of social media, ironically, a lot of young people just go onto YouTube and learn to sing, for example. And then notice there you can see there's the chair, stuff like that. But what's interesting there is the tree that you have in the background. So it's kind of like a tree of life. So young people are using that to put for any occasions that were memorable for them. They'll take pictures and they will just pin it onto the tree, all facilitated by young people, which is fantastic, I think. So let's have a look a bit more about this pathway and how it works. So as you can see from the diagram, you've got your referrals coming in, your emergency admissions, you've got your crash pad, you've got your assessments, which should likely happen the same day. Then you can have a look at the mediation, you know, how long is that going to take, or is it respite, for example? Then obviously a decision's got to be made from there. So basically, you know, there's two sides. You can go into the crash pod between 24 and 48 hours. Then you can either move into the actual assessment centre, which will be long for 6 to 12 weeks. We can do more detailed work with a young person, try to resolve some of those issues. And then you can see at the end there, you know, the outcome, return home, you know, move to YP accommodation, etc. So let's talk a bit more about partnership working, because in my view, any good work with young people needs partnership working. And it's very important as well. And also from Billy talked about, and also talked about the emergency food support, you know, 276%, which I thought was quite ironic as well. This shows you some of the challenges. So obviously a young person coming to a crash pad, it's usually an emergency situation, so they don't have anything, obviously. And that's where we need to be working with partners to make sure that young people got resources when they come into the crash pad. So we've done a bit of work with partnership working. We're quite fortunate that we've got a partnership manager, and we started to do a lot of work with different partners there. So one of those partners are with Canary Wharf Group. And obviously with our customer and sponsorship manager to deliver tailored first steps in employment as well, support young people employment skills in order to gain employment. And obviously one of the key features of that is donations, you know, which are vital, providing much needed support to these young people. Many of them arrived at the service with little or no personal items or money. So what kind of partnerships have we got here? We've got quite a few at this service, you know, Pret, Nando's, Hungerford Bakery, KFC's, Greg's, for example, which is fantastic. So they're on the rota, but they bring food into the service, and all that food is dated and fridged, and all the young people are encouraged to come and take in the kind of as and when they need it, you know. And then we've got some other partnerships you can see there with the Prince's Trust, with Street Lead, as I said, our own internal employment training team, you know, the Randaz fantastic in Camden, doing arts, music, etc. Youth clubs, you know, very important for young people to engage as well around employment and training as well. And we also run the Duke of Edinburgh Award, which we're not currently running at the moment due to COVID, but it's been vital learning to us running the Duke of Edinburgh Award. I'll give you an interesting fact about it. We ran the Duke of Edinburgh for a young mum who was under child protection, and she managed to get a bronze award. And as far as I'm aware, she's the only young woman I know of who managed to get a bronze award after being on child protection. I thought that was quite an interesting antidote. So what types of people come to Whites Row? So many of the young people referred to Whites Row have had troubled backgrounds. Some come from families with domestic violence or those experiencing drug and alcohol issues. We also have young people fleeing forced marriages or those at risk from it, as well as those that have been forced to leave the family home due to their sexuality or relationship status. So I thought it'd be quite useful to talk to you a bit about, you know, the mediation, and obviously part of the key feature of this service is a mediation at the service. So I thought what would be useful to give you a bit of a case study. So to start off with, Emma moved into White Row. She was 17 years old, attended college at the time of her moving in. She was studying for mock exams at college. Emma lived in a family home and then was asked to move out by her father to live with her grandmother. There was also issues with that home because her uncle was verbally abusive to her grandmother. Following a home visit from a social worker, it became quite evident that the father did not want to take responsibility to care for his daughter and would rather see her live elsewhere besides home due to issues around social media, suspicion that she had a boyfriend. It was agreed that Emma would stay at Whites Row, but she needed to do work with everyone around mediation and her father, with a view to possibly moving back home. Now, Emma agreed and worked with the social worker, the key worker, the mediator, staff member, and AO at Whites Row to achieve this goal. So a mediation session was arranged to take place at the family home. Emma's father said that a family friend would be attending to help them mediate issues because the family felt he had a better understanding of the family and the culture. The session was attended by Emma, her key worker, the mediator, the mother, the father, and a family friend. AO and Emma agreed that Emma and her father were both given equal speaking time to express how they feel and come to agreement. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because what you can see there's some sort of negotiation here, understanding a bit about the family background, the family culture, respecting everyone's point of view here, but bringing everybody together to kind of, come to a solution. We've got the mediator, which is the staff at the White Row. We've got the problem. Now we're starting to look at solution, and the solution's got to involve everybody. Yeah, stuff like that. So after a few hours, they both were able to come to some mutual agreements around boundaries, curfew, and the expectation put in working agreement, which both parties signed. MR returned home after 2 days. So to sum that all up, what we've got going on there is quite interesting. That we've got support the young person in communication with their families, relatives, or friends, facilitate a safe return home through the use of mediation. So I think it's quite a useful look at, how mediation can be looked. And also one of the most effective things is that it stops homelessness. One of the key things from the previous presentation was how many, the family breakdown I saw, I think from Billy's presentation, I think it was 59%. So that's important, isn't it? We want to stop that family breakdown that leads to homelessness in the future. So thank you. That was kind of a whistle tour of everything. That's a picture of me with Ledley King and One House, and do a number of kind of youth events. We haven't been able to do one due to COVID, but we like to do a lot of youth events with young people. And we love to give them awards as well, because young people are the future, and I want to leave you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. That was excellent overview of what you do at One Housing. I think it's great you've got a partnerships manager. That must be really useful person to have on board, because not only obviously it sounds like the food aspect, but the training and employability. Young people want to go into work, don't they? So yeah, and the Duke of Edinburgh story is lovely. Having that young person who was able to get their bronze award must have been fantastic. So hopefully you'll be able to get that off the ground again after the pandemic at some point. And it's really interesting about the mediation as well, because ultimately what you say is, the end result is we want to avoid homelessness, and if we can do that by a bit of mediation and get someone back in their family home after 2 days, then that's an excellent result. So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone has any questions. Can't see any at the moment. I had a question actually about the move on side, really. So Billy mentioned obviously the changes in the universal credit and how that's helping young people to move into the private rental sector. I mean, for One Housing, what sort of what are the options available to young people when they come to the time they have to leave supported accommodation, and in what ways do you help them to be able to move on?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. I think move on should always start when the young person first enters the service. I think too many young people were told going into the service that it's too late by then. I think they need to start to identify that quite early on and start to work towards that goal. So there's quite different ranges depending on the young person's circumstance. Obviously, the statutory requirement, obviously, if they're a care leaver, then obviously there's a requirement from the local authority to house that young person. That's one way they were going to get housed. The second one, if you're homeless, then that becomes much more tricky, because obviously it's rather you're waiting on the register to be housed, or what you're really saying is you're going into PS, in a sense, which is PR, sorry, which is private rented. There's very few, as highlighted, available, and there needs to be more options for young people. We've got a couple of move on properties for young people straight directly after they leave the service, but there needs to be more, and that's affordable.
Thanks, Ray. I can't see any more questions at this point. So if anyone has anything, please do type in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up on that one. So I'll give people a bit of time to ask anything. So is your partnerships manager then, is that funded by one, or do you have funding from, does it come from one of your local authority partners?
It's essential funding. It's from one, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was a good investment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's amazing.
And she also, yeah. So she also gets in. Sorry?
Amazing what you can access when you know you've got someone focused on that particular role.
Yes.
It's essential, and I think that organisations should consider having that element, because the partnership manager has just been phenomenal. I'll give an example. During the lockdown, able to work with Vodafone, EE to get SIM cards for young people, work with businesses regarding getting young people additional food donations, clothes. Obviously, one of the things during the pandemic was getting young people access to what we call IT equipment, whether it was laptops, computers, etc.
Yeah,
so,
TVs.
Under work, you know,
yeah.
I think it's really phenomenal doing that partnership working. But also on top of that as well, doing some things in the building, for example, working with businesses to do the garden, for example, upgrade, for example, with Unilever. Unilever came down to a parenting service where they helped fit out the whole garden, which was a very successful as well. It feeds in also to their corporate identity, i.e. helping the community, etc. So when those two things align, you can get partners who will work together with you to deliver the service.
We do have one question from Andrew Hudson. I'll just check where Andrew's from actually, but I probably can't because my list isn't in alphabetical order. Oh, okay. Andrew's from the Centre for Homelessness Impact, and he says family breakdown has been a theme today. Is there more that could be done to begin mediation earlier to try and stop the breakdown occurring? I'm not sure really. I guess Ray, maybe you could answer that one, and perhaps Lucy might be able to as well. Yes, about the mediation really, and where it can begin.
Well, that's an interesting one you're saying that, because that's really about connecting that family to the appropriate services. So I think that there needs to be more work done in order that families are aware that they can seek help when they're struggling. You know, we had a young person, for example, who was going to be made homeless because the family didn't want him playing the PlayStation later. Now, in my eyes, I think that's something that can be resolved. So let's get the, you know, we need these mediation services more highlighted out for families, so they can contact, and apologies because my alarm's going outside, because I think some of it's not aligned in the sense that where the family can have access to these services, so they come in. Some of it's a bit of fear as well, that they're going to interfere with the wider what's happening with the family thing. So I think we need to give people confidence as well, that, you know, that we can come, you know, we do understand, and that's why I wanted to highlight that story, because if you listen to that mediation, there was a lot of cultural stuff involved there, and there was a lot of stereotyping and a lot of perceptions of how people, you know, what believe a woman should be, for example, you know. And I think that's important there, that people understand that, you know, we need to give people the opportunity to grow and to develop. And I think that the mediation can be a way to kind of hear different sides of it and come to some form of an agreement about it. So yes, I'd like to see more mediation services available all across the UK.
Absolutely. And Lucy, does that resonate with your service and charity? I mean, obviously the cultural side and the stereotypes may be, I guess, an influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, because we've often talked about family work and how do we approach that. So we'll never turn anyone away that wants to come and talk about supporting their child. We understand a lot of people find it difficult to cope, and sometimes there's a lot of shock involved, that people maybe are outed or come out, and it can be a bit of a surprise to families, and it might take a little bit of time and space for those relationships to rebuild. As an organisation, we always advocate on behalf of the young person, so we can't be neutral And where the young person wants that and wants to have that relationship with family, we'll absolutely get other organisations involved, because sometimes it is just about a bit of time and space. But unfortunately, what we tend to see is that if a family's approached, they might say, this isn't a problem, everything's fine, you don't need to get involved, we're fine with their sexuality or gender identity, and then it tends to be a very different story when nobody else is around. So I think that's the difficulty for us, but there absolutely is a place for mediation. And I think that for some young people, they want their family to be supportive. It's not a choice that they're making. They would, you know, when they've come out or they've been outed, they want that family support. But for some young people, they know that it's not safe for them to be there, and it may never be safe for them to be back. But we would always encourage people, where possible, to retain those family relationships, because it's not just about being housed, is it? It's about all the other things that come along. So we have a rent deposit scheme precisely because a lot of people can't get that support from their families. But yeah, absolutely, when it works, it's great. And we have had parents come and go, I don't know what to do, I'm not really sure how to cope with this, I need a bit of a break. Or, you know, we had a young person who came to us who was trans but had to share a bedroom with his siblings, so wasn't able to explore their identity. The family were like, we just don't have room for them to have a private bedroom, and we took them into our host program so they had that safe space to explore, and it gave the family a bit of a space to process their side, and also the young person the freedom and the support to do and be who they are. So I think it's that thing of like, actually it's important to have family, but if it's not healthy and if it's causing more damage to that young person, then we would always advocate the young people leave and work with us to find a solution.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I don't believe we have any other questions, so I think we will wrap up the session. But thank you to our speakers on behalf of Homes for Cathy for taking the time to talk to everyone today and share lots of insightful stats and advice and suggestions for you know, how the housing sector can respond better to the needs of young people. So on that note, I will say goodbye, and yep, do keep your eyes peeled for any other events coming up. We've got an event on tenancy training coming up later this month in partnership with Crisis, on how tenancy training can work better, how it can be delivered, how it can be improved. And yes, you're all very welcome to attend. So we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.